Okay, so this is part 3 of the video series on how to convert your brushed car to brushless. So in the last video, we talked about the relationships between the parts. We talked conceptually about the motor, about the ESC, and about the battery. We talked about what volts means, what amperage means, and how they come together and what they mean in that relationship of the overall power system. So in this video, we're going to talk about the math. We're going to go ahead and finally crunch some numbers. It's not going to be hard, so just follow step by step, and you'll get it after this video, and you'll be able to crunch your own numbers. Part of the reason why I started this video has to do with a response to what I've been seeing in Facebook groups, where a lot of people are asking about the combo units that include the motor and the ESC. And they're buying those combo units, and they're finding that the ESCs are burning out. So when you crunch the numbers, after you learn how to do it in the video, you'll go back as an exercise and go ahead and crunch those numbers for those combo units. And you'll find that in over 90% of the cases that the ESC is not sufficient for the amp draw of the motor that they include, which is a problem, a big problem. So in other words, the ESC isn't big enough for the motor that they're including. And so it's no wonder that they're burning out. So after this video and you're able to crunch the numbers, you're going to go ahead and be able to select your own components and do the own math so that you have a system that you can rely on. So that you don't have to worry about a motor getting hot, you don't have to worry about an ESC burning out, you don't have to worry about a battery getting stressed out and possibly burning out too. So let's go ahead and get started right now. Hi, KV rating. I know you're looking at it. So how do you pick a KV rating? Do you choose a big one, small one? So generally speaking, a higher KV rating means higher end top speed. However, at the expense of acceleration. So higher KV means slower acceleration, but higher top speed. And the opposite is also true. If you have a lower KV rating, you have higher acceleration, but a lower top speed. So how would you pick one versus the other? So for me, I like to think of it in terms of where I drive the car. So if you have a lot of space, and I mean a lot of space, you'll need a lot of space for full throttle, long enough to reach the top speed. If you're driving this in a more limited space, like a smaller backyard, smaller front yard, or a cul-de-sac, or maybe a playground, then you may enjoy the car more if it had improved acceleration versus top speed, which you may never get to because you don't have enough stretch of land to reach that distance. So that's one way to choose between a lower KV and a higher KV. In the last video, we talked about these 4 numbers here, the physical size of the can. And after you decide what KV rating you have, we're going to talk about how to size the ESC accordingly. This particular motor is a 3650 4300 kV motor. So you don't need to do any math here. You just look up the spec of the motor from the manufacturer or anywhere else online. And this particular one happens to be 75 amps. So what I like to do is to have a factor of 15 above that. So 75 amps, adding 15% is 90 amps. So that makes me comfortable to have an ESC that is larger than 90 amps. So ESCs generally come in 25 amps, 35 amps, 60, sometimes 80, which is less common, and 120. So the ESC that's higher than 90 is going to be 120. So that's why I have this 120 amp ESC.
I realize that 120 amp ESC may be a bit overboard and is substantially higher than an 80 amp ESC. An 80 amp ESC, if you're doing this on your own, is probably sufficient for the 75 amp motor. However, by upsizing, it gives me opportunity to change out motors or replace it and still reuse the ESC at a future date.
So we're literally just comparing the numbers. The amperage of the ESC needs to be higher than the amperage of the motor, and that's literally it. Apart from the amperage rating of the motor, what else do we need to be worried about as we're looking at the specifications? The second thing we need to worry about for the motor is going to be the RPM rating. So for this motor, we're going to look at 2 different things. Again, it's amperage and RPM. So we'll get to RPM later, but those are 2 numbers you want to write down. So the next component we'll be talking about is the ESC. So far we've talked about the amperage rating and how that needs to exceed the amperage rating of the motor. ESCs have another spec that we want to write down, and that is the number of volts, or how many S that can run through the ESC. So you're just going to look at the specs and see what they are. For this particular one by Surpass Hobby, 120 amps, This is rated for 2 to 6S, meaning 2 to 6 cells. Just so you're not confused, just because this is rated for 2 to 6S does not mean that you can run this on 6S and be safe with the motor. Because when Surpass Hobby or any other company sells the ESC, they don't necessarily know what motor you're going to be using. So the ESC itself is safe for 2 to 6S, but that says nothing about the motor and the whole power assembly. So we're going to go ahead and just write that down for now, and then we will do the calculations later and talk about how it relates to the motor. We know our ESC can handle the amp rating of the motor because the amp rating is higher than the motor, but how do we know about the battery? How do we determine if the battery can support the amperage draw of the motor? So if we look carefully at this battery or any other battery, we see it does not have an amp rating. So we're gonna have to calculate this on our own using the mAh rating as well as the C rating. And this is how we're gonna do it. The equation is going to be this. The mAh rating times the C rating divided by 1,000 equals amps. So in this example, we'll leave this here. In this example, we have 1,500 milliamps times 120C. So 1,500 times 120C divided by 1,000. Alexa, what is 1,500 times 120?
1,500 times 120 is 180,000.
So 180,000 divided by 1,000 is 180. So this battery can handle 180 amps, which is plenty for the demands of this motor. Earlier I said one of the other specs of the motor that we need to be concerned about is the RPM. So how do we know that this battery won't exceed the RPM limit of the motor? So the reason why we're talking about the battery now is because the battery is what generates RPM. And we all know we just are doing this project to make sure that our RC car goes faster. That's the end goal. And so in order to achieve that, the RPM needs to be as high as possible, but within the limit of the motor. So what we're doing is we're balancing a combination of a motor with a battery such that the RPM being generated by the battery into the motor does not exceed the limit of the motor, but is close. If we get too high, then the motor can't handle it safely. And if it's too low, then you're not reaching the full potential of the motor and you're not using it as effectively as you could. So we're gonna go ahead and do some simple math and we'll go through that right now. It'll be very easy. And we're gonna basically calculate the RPM compared to the rating of the motor and see how close those numbers are. So in order to calculate RPM for your setup is the following. kV times volts equals RPM. So this is a 4,300 kV motor. So we multiply that by 3S. This is 11.1 volts. So we multiply 4,300 times 11.1, we get 47,730 RPM. So the rating for this is 50,000 RPM. So 47 something is just shy of 50. If we were to run this on 2S, a 2S battery would be 7.4 volts. So 4,300 times 7.4 would be 31,820 RPM. So we'll call it 32,000 RPM compared to the rating of 50. So you're not reaching the maximum capacity to make this efficient. So if you were to use 3S, then it would be 47,000, which is closer to that 50,000. So this system can handle both 2S and 3S. So you might be wondering, can this system handle 4S? So let's do the math. 4,300 times 14.8 volts, which is 4S, equals 63,640 RPM. So 61,000 something is higher than the capacity of the 50,000 that this is. So this will not safely run under 4S. So 3S is going to be the maximum for this particular setup. We went through a lot today, so I thought we'd summarize, kind of zoom things back, and then go over everything in the big picture. So we had selected a motor, and we found the amp rating of it and the RPM. Then we selected an ESC that exceeded the amp rating of the motor and took note of the voltage or the number of S that it can handle. And then we picked a battery that is within the tolerance of the ESC, which creates RPM that is within the limits of the motor. So once we've done that and all the numbers jive, then you have a system that is reliable, that you don't need to be concerned about the motor getting hot or the ESC burning or the battery burning or getting hot or stressed out. And so as you're doing these calculations with the various components that you have, you may find some of the numbers do not jive and you'll have to readjust. So for instance, if you have your motor and then you picked your ESC and you calculate the RPM, and the RPM of your battery exceeds the limit of the motor, then you'll have two options. One is you can decrease the size of the motor and use possibly the same battery. Or you can decrease the battery such that the RPM is lower. And so it's a juggling act between motor and battery and ESC and all the tolerances and ratings and limits of each component. So now that you know how those numbers come together and how to read those numbers and what would make sense, you're prepared to create a power system that'll work for your RC build. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave the comments down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So good luck with your project, take care, and see you next time, bye. All right, so you're still here, so you deserve some bonus information. So some of you may be arguing that you've used an ESC that had an amp rating below that of the motor, and your components are doing just fine. So the reason for that is that depending on how hard you run the vehicle, you may never reach the full amp draw of the motor. So if you never reach the full demands of the motor, then an ESC can technically have an amp rating that is not as high as the amp rating of the motor. Another thing we hadn't discussed is efficiency. So everything we've discussed today has to do with assuming full efficiency of the vehicle. It doesn't take into account the gearing. It doesn't take into account the wheel size. It doesn't take into account friction or the delicacy or quality of the components. It doesn't take into account any sort of elevation. It doesn't take into any account sort of terrain, whether we're going on grass or smooth road. So a lot of those variables will affect how much amp draw you are pulling from the motor. So the scope of this video talked about the components within the car, but it did not discuss the car itself. So the chassis of any given RC car will have its own limits based on the drivetrain. So it's not that you can have a motor that generates, let's say, 100,000 RPM, and then a battery that doesn't exceed that and everything will be fine. There is a limit to the car. So the drivetrain, the pinion gear, the differential, there is a limit. It's kind of like putting a giant engine into a tiny car. So it will make it go faster, but the chassis itself and the components, the drivetrain, do have their limits that are separate from the electronic components running the car. So just want to talk about that. I didn't forget, but for newbies who just want to talk just about the components and how they come together and how to select those for a vehicle, I think you have a good idea and good background on being able to select your components. I still feel for a new build, especially when you have the opportunity to purchase new equipment, new components, that you create as big of a tolerance level as you possibly can for those components. That way you don't need to be so disciplined and controlled in how you drive the car. And you don't have to be worried about burning ESCs, burning batteries, burning out motors, and you can concentrate on the joy of driving, because we all know that you may crash into something and you'll have those types of parts to worry about. The chassis parts, the swing arms, all those kinds of things. So the last thing you need is a headache and anything that could involve a fire or damage to the car in an even bigger extent. So for that reason, I still recommend having an ESC with an amp rating larger than that of the motor. So those of you who are a little bit more disciplined and a little bit more under control or experience have a knack for how much throttle and how long you can hold that throttle for with your components for your particular car. But for new people who aren't necessarily as experienced, they may not understand that threshold. So for that reason, and again, for anyone who's new, and you have the opportunity to start fresh with new components, it's probably best that you select stuff that you know isn't going to get damaged.